Welcome to our event on the trucker convoy in the Department of Political Science at UTM or from wherever you're joining us. So my name is Randy Besko and I'm a professor here in the department, and I'm just going to get us started, and then I will hand things off to Professor Smith and our guests. So first, I'd just like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this is still home to many Indigenous people, and we are grateful to be here on this land. We have two guests with us today, which I'm very happy to welcome. We have Justin Ling, who is an award-winning investigative journalist who specializes in stories about, among other things, privacy, security, politics, and law. And his work has been published by CBC, Maclean's, the Toronto Star, and many, many other places. And he's also the author of a book about the Toronto serial killer Bruce McArthur and a podcast series, The Flamethrowers, about the history of right-wing talk radio, which I endorse, and all of you should check that out. And we have Professor Amarnath Amarasingam, who is a professor at Queen's University in the Department of Religion and Political Studies. And he studies a wide range of topics, including, most importantly for us today, radicalization and extremism and online communities. In addition to 2 books and over 40 academic articles, which if you're not an academic, that's very impressive. And his work has been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, and other places as well. And lastly, I'd like to introduce our own Professor Allison Smith, and she's going to be managing the questions and help moderating the discussion today. For those of you who are joining us, please keep your microphones muted, just so it doesn't get too chaotic. But feel free to put questions in the chat, and Professor Smith will keep track of those, and she'll sort of put some of them together and ask them of our guests. So with that, I will hand things off to Professor Smith and we'll get it started.
Great, thanks. So thank you, thanks Randy. Thank you to Justin Ling and Amarnath Amarasingam for being here with us today. We will be, this is our second day of the public affairs kind of series. So it's like a lot that's going on at a busy time of year, but I think it's really exciting, the conversations that we're having. So I look forward to the next hour or so, a little longer than that. So I'll begin with a couple of questions for the panelists. And then, as Randy said, afterwards, we can open up the floor. So the first question, and I'll begin with Justin. And Justin, you had a very long, very interesting article in the Toronto Star published last week, kind of exactly about this. But if you could maybe take a few moments and discuss some of the history of where the truck convoy came from, and once you're finished, we'll get the same question to Amar as well.
Yeah, sure. So thanks for having me. For starters, the truck convoy, the media has loved to portray this as a sort of organic response in relation to vaccine mandates for truckers, right? That has been the thing you've seen repeated ad nauseum. This was a sort of automatic knee-jerk reaction that formed in response to vaccine mandates for truckers, or the vaccine passport system, or any number of public health interventions around COVID-19, and the simple reality is it's just not the case. That's just not true. You can kind of go quite a far ways back to understand some of the origins of the grievances and complaints that many of the people involved had, but I think most usefully you can go back to 2019. There was another convoy that made its way to Ottawa that time in protest of federal carbon pricing measures, and many of the people who came out this past few months were intimately involved in that. So Pat King, one of the most important organizers of the convoy to Ottawa this time around, was a route captain in 2019 in protest of carbon taxes, and really more pointedly in protest of the Prime Minister. Right, he formed a belief that Justin Trudeau is dangerous for the country and that needs to be removed. And there was an earnest and deeply held belief that the convoy to Ottawa in 2019 would convince the Prime Minister to step down, or convince his party to remove him, or convince Parliament to unseat him, or whatever. Also on that convoy was a guy named James Botter, who is an ardent conspiracy theorist, follower of QAnon, the QAnon conspiracy theory, believer that the Prime Minister has committed acts of treason, genuinely believes that many of our politicians should be arrested and locked up. And the two of them, were intimately involved in this convoy to Ottawa. And what was really interesting about the 2019 convoy is that they pulled right into downtown Ottawa. They set up a stage either on Parliament Hill or at some points kind of on Wellington Street facing Parliament, and they were kind of allowed free reign of the city. They decided to only stay for a weekend, luckily, but the reality is they were kind of given a blank check to sort of run the downtown core. And not only that, they also had the ardent support of the Conservative Party. Andrew Scheer, then the leader, came out to join them. There was about a dozen MPs who came out to support them. They raised something like $150,000. They had a number of groups who joined in the cause. They got a massive amount of publicity. And I think they walked away feeling like it was a big success. So as the years went by, I think the idea had been percolating in their heads that if we do this again, it could be, if we even put kind of a little more effort into it, if we kind of expand it out, it could even be a more impactful effort than the one they made in 2019. So there had been a growing prevalence of some of these right-wing, predominantly conspiracy groups over the last number of years. The pandemic, locking everyone in their homes, creating this kind of international disaster, I think has only kind of intensified the radicalization that we've seen in a ton of different groups. So, rewind the clock back to the summer, early fall of 2020, a huge number of people, at least a few hundred, maybe almost as high as 1,000 people came out to Ottawa, some from across the country, with a plan to go and arrest the Prime Minister for crimes against humanity and child trafficking and corruption and 8 other things. And this was entirely motivated by a belief that the law basically criminalized Trudeau's behavior, the whole government's behavior, really. I always say Trudeau, but really their grievances with almost every single member of Parliament who's not of the right flank of the Conservative Party. And they had this belief that Trudeau had contravened not only domestic law, but international law. And they decided to hang their hat on the new USMCA agreement. This group of people led by a guy named Norman Traversy, waved around this prosecution. He'd been trying to lay private prosecution charges against the Prime Minister for months. But this was his kind of big coming out, where he said, we're gonna march over to the American embassy and we're gonna hand this document to them, and they're going to start proceedings against the Prime Minister because we have the law on our side, right? And people joined on this because this wasn't just a protest, right? This wasn't just a gathering where everyone got together and waved flags and signs and said, please leave the office, please leave the Prime Minister's office. This was a mechanism that Traversy and these others told their followers would actually enable real action. It would actually lead to the Prime Minister and the government being removed and a new kind of patriots movement taking over. And never mind, this is all complete nonsense. This is just legal mumbo jumbo. They genuinely believe that this was an actual lever they could pull and enact change with. So when they assembled on Parliament Hill, Norman Traversy stood at the microphone with this binder full of documents. Standing behind him was Pat King, again, this guy who had been there in 2019 for his own convoy to Ottawa. And they marched over to the front steps of the American embassy and tried to lay these charges against Trudeau, or try to get this investigation started or whatever. And obviously they were kind of laughed out of the room. But nevertheless, they sort of kind of kept it up. They genuinely believed they were onto something. They genuinely believed they were about to enact change, and they kept pushing. Some of their followers actually did end up occupying downtown Ottawa. A number of them set up a camp on the National War Memorial facing Parliament and stayed there, vowing not to leave until the Prime Minister was arrested or under investigation at the very least. A number of them tried to enact citizens' arrests of members of parliament who were kind of wandering through the city. I believe one of the people who kind of came to the city from out west for this gathering, a guy named Corey Huron, drove his truck through the front gates of Rideau Hall with a cabin full of weapons and seemingly a plan to kill the prime minister, or at the very least take him hostage. So we have been, folks like me, folks like MR have been following groups like this for years now, and realizing that this is not just a hypothetical threat, this is not just a kooky gathering of conspiracy theorists, but it is quite legitimately a increasingly prevalent belief that they have the law on their side, that everything else is corrupt, and that they're the only ones with sort of the belief or the willpower to make change. And as the pandemic went on, a bunch of these groups that kind of adhere to this belief system have been working in isolation. They've been holding rallies in downtown Toronto. They've been, protesting outside of hospitals, sometimes inside hospitals. They've been, camping out in front of legislatures and city halls across the country, and they just haven't got on the same page. They have not started coordinating. They have not cooperated in any major way. There's been maybe a dozen major groups and 24 major organizers, and they very, very rarely work together. When James Bauder, of course, who was in that 2019 convoy, decided to get the gang all together and put out the call to get all these groups working in conjunction, I think a lot of them realized how sensible of an idea that really was, and they did. And this is everything from groups that represent cops and firefighters who have been removed from the job for not being vaccinated. This is another group who's tried to sue the federal government, alleging that they are part of an international plot to microchip and surveil the population. You have another group that has peddled some of the most odious and nonsensical anti-vaccine misinformation. You have another group that has peddled all sorts of make-believe stuff about lockdown measures. You've had individual organizers who have been noted conspiracy theorists for many years. Of course, you have Pat King, you have James Bauder, Norman Traversy got in on this. The gang kind of all came together, and when they first took off for Ottawa, the first leg leaving northern BC in kind of January 22nd, I think, you saw all of these groups start rowing in the same direction for the first time in years and years and years. And you saw the consequences of that. It is not a massively popular movement. It was 18,000 people at its apex in the downtown core in Ottawa. It was maybe another 10,000 tops people who came out to support them, who came out in solidarity rallies, who came out in other protests around the country. But it's a group of folks who do have resources behind them, clearly, who have learned what tactics work and what don't, who have learned what messages are motivating, and who genuinely believe, I think, with some exceptions of people who are frankly hucksters, I think they genuinely believe that the things they are doing are the last stand before tyranny fully takes hold, who believe that the law protects and supports them in what they're doing, and who believes that the government is defending an illegitimate and corrupt regime, and that they have kind of a moral obligation to fight it. It's incredibly dangerous. I think there's a ton of people involved with this who are earnest, who are almost admirable in their belief that what they're doing is right, but who are probably a serious national security threat. And I don't think any of us are taking it seriously enough. I know we'll come back to the politics question in a minute, but I think there's still politicians in this country who are not just playing footsie anymore, but who are actively encouraging this movement. And I think it's a matter of time before something really bad happens.
Wow.
End on a really positive note.
Okay, thank you. We will come back to you. That was really interesting. That was really great. Thank you so much for walking us through a lot of that history. Amar, I wanted to get your perspective on it as well. You've called this kind of a maturing of populism in Canada. I wonder if you have anything to add, or a different perspective to that, to where this has come from.
Yeah, sure. I mean, Justin mentioned the grievances and complaints that kind of predate 2019, and that's kind of where I would begin the story, right? In the sense of like, there's always been a populist current in Canada, but it's really, I think, and COVID was a major turning point, as I'll come back to kind of bring all this to the forefront and bring all these kind of disparate groups and movements and individuals together around a common cause, around a common enemy, and so on. But populism, just quickly for your students, is often defined as this kind of dichotomy between this kind of elite group of people who are usually coded as evil, sinister, a kind of homogenous blob that's controlling the planet, and then the people, right? Like the true Canadians, the true Americans, the true patriots, the common people who are the true engines of the economy, who are the true patriots of a particular country. There's an important element of populism, which some people have called, producerism, which I think we saw over and over again in the Convoy, is this idea that the true Canadians or the true people are the ones who are the construction workers, the truck drivers, the farmers. There's a lot of romanticism around the farmers and truck drivers in Canada and the US, for example, and so that notion of the people who are the minority, but are the kind of vanguard against ongoing corruption that's happening in societies. I think what a lot of what we saw on the streets of Ottawa and in other parts of the country, that and I've interviewed a lot of former neo-Nazis and QAnon supporters and all of this, and they all have this in common, that they have been tasked with awakening a sleeping masses, right? And it's a massively important, emotionally, psychologically satisfying thing to believe about yourself, that you have a cosmic significance, that you've been tasked with this massively important role to awaken the public to the true realities of the world, what's truly keeping them asleep, and so that all of that rhetoric was very much part of the trucker convoy. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic, I remember in March 2020, a lot of researchers were talking about second and third order consequences of COVID, right? And a lot of what we had in mind was kind of psychological impact on children and communities and so on. But of course, this kind of maturing of conspiracy theories is also part and parcel of that, right? We've seen a complete collapse of trust, and it doesn't start with the pandemic. It starts with Trump and Bannon, and it starts with in 2016 and onwards, and even before that with the kind of alternative media landscape that Justin did a whole podcast about, that kind of brings about the climate in 2020 for a kind of increasing collapse of social trust in public health officials, in media, in academics, in kind of traditional sources of information, which kind of pushes a lot of this misinformation and division forward, right? And so for the first time, you had COVID conspiracy theories go through the roof in March 2020. And if I had slides, I can, I would show how these numbers changed. But it was clear that anyone who had anything to say about COVID conspiracy theories also got a boost, right? So QAnon groups who were latching onto COVID conspiracy theories, Proud Boys, 3%ers, whatever group you wanted to bring into the conversation, if they mentioned COVID conspiracies of any kind, 5G, bioweapon stuff, whatever it might be, they saw their engagement go through the roof as well, right? And for the first time, a lot of these disparate individuals and groups and movements had a common enemy, had a common thing to yell about. And so you had them kind of coalesce. They found themselves in the same chat rooms and groups on Telegram and other platforms, and kind of, pushed all of this into a bit of a mainstream and maturing, as I've said, which I think culminates in January 6th for sure, but in the Canadian sphere, the trucker convoy.
Thanks. So kind of like a similar a similar story, but from a slightly different perspective of sort of different groups doing different things, but then there being a moment where, you know, whether it's a common enemy or a common moment or opportunity to sort of come together. And so that sort of culminated in what we saw in Ottawa. Justin, if there's anything that you'd like to kind of add or respond to that, it seemed like you were taking notes or something, or we can move to the next question.
Yeah, no, I was going to say really briefly, because I mean, Amarnath mentioned my podcast, so now I'm obligated to start touting it. As part of this, and you know, it's been part of the work I've been doing for quite some time. But if you go back through the 20th century, it's not been a constant, but you see waves of this idea, and it's been particular to each different country, but at least, you know, in the US and Canada and to some degree Europe, you see this kind of occasional thread. Sometimes we kind of call it a bit of a fifth column problem. Sometimes, you know, we call it by different names, but this idea that the sort of old guard of a country is under threat by a new kind of infiltration by a foreign enemy, or sometimes it's even an internal enemy, but with foreign linkages. And you go back to the early 20th century, and you see this in Tsarist Russia. You see a group who are in Tsar Peter. My Russian history isn't great, but the Tsar's court, you see a number of kind of political apparatchiks who start feeling the heat from an increasingly you know, critical movement, and they come up with this brilliant forgery. They crib a really crappy French novel that no one read. And they invent a plot. So they invent a document that claims that an international cabal of Jewish bankers are at work to destabilize the Russian regime and to bring about some kind of socialism, to bring about, you know, the destruction of the state, and to kind of put all of the people of Russia under the thumb of this international money cabal. They called it the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and it has been probably the most important anti-Semitic work in human history. It was a basis document for Hitler when he wrote Mein Kampf. It has been used to persecute Jews in just about every country in the 20th century and even the 21st century, and is actually today an incredibly important document for QAnon and a number of other far-right neo-Nazi groups. You know, you go into the 1960s, it takes a different form. The American kind of arch, you know, far right, it comes up with this allegation that that the Soviet Union has managed to infiltrate the U.S. government all the way up to the presidency. They allege that John F. Kennedy is part of an international conspiracy to weaken American institutions, to decrease the power of the kind of American patriots, and to you know, bring the U.S. under Soviet control. This is promoted by the John Birch Society, who came up with all sort of kooky, you know, allegations that allege that the UN and JFK and everyone in the White House and everyone in Congress, this sort of fed into McCarthyism, but that they were all agents of Soviet infiltration. You go to the 90s, and I'm just going to go kind of, it's the last one, but you go to the 90s, and the same allegation pops up. And it's somebody we actually focus on for our podcast. In particular, there's a guy named William Cooper, who's a radio host, who comes up with this elaborate allegation that the United Nations and the World Trade Organization and a whole bunch, and the Bilderberg Group, and a whole bunch of these international organizations, some of which are you know, legitimate bodies, some of which are sort of inconsequential, you know, industry groups or conferences or whatever, that all of them have worked hand in glove to weaken American democracy, to open the borders for immigration, and to effectively kind of decrease the political power of white people. You know, that conspiracy theory has become incredibly prevalent today. Pat King, you know, I don't think he even realizes it, but is espousing the idea that our governments are bringing in non-white refugees in order to decrease the political power of white people, and in effect, you know, make them, you know, incapable of resisting this one world totalitarian government that's coming in. Pretty much every single organizer, if not every single organizer, has promoted the idea that the World Economic Forum is the new body through which our politicians are being bought and sold and indoctrinated by and infiltrated by, so that they can bring about this new socialist, they call it a Great Reset, that will ultimately kind of subjugate our democracy to this international socialist Chinese style system. In fact, one of the main influential organizers of the occupation, a guy named Tom Quiggin, is an incredibly influential figure internationally with this conspiracy theory. The guy who produces his podcast is Benjamin Ditchter, one of the main founders of the Convoy, one of the main spokespeople. Tamara Leach, who people have probably seen on the news as the founder of the GoFundMe that raised $10 million, got banned, raised another $10 million. Well, she helped to organize events for Tom Quiggin just a couple of years ago. So it's very frustrating to watch us do this all again and not realize it. It's very frustrating to realize that we're in the exact same sort of ridiculous fifth column conspiracy theory that has just been dressed up with some makeup on it, and everyone kind of acts like it's new and novel, and like maybe they have a lot of good points. It's functionally the same thing we've been doing for 110 years, and we just keep falling for it.
Again, thank you for that. That's a important perspective. And I mean, not everyone has the time to keep track of all of this and sort of put all of these things together. So it's great that we have people like you who are able to put that together in historic perspective. I wanted to move to the next question, but Amar, was there anything else that you wanted to say before we move on?
No.
Okay. So the next question, and I do want to sort of get into what this means for the future of politics in Canada in a moment, but there is, of course, the very important question of how everything just played out in Ottawa, why it took so long for there to be a response, why those trucks that aren't supposed to be on Wellington Street even got onto Wellington Street. I remember I watched it all kind of from Saturday morning till Sunday afternoon, and there was like a tension because there was kind of a concern, like, how is this going to end once everything sort of bubbled up and the police became involved? There was a concern that there might be weapons, that things might really escalate. The fact that it even got to that point, though, is kind of not inevitable. We've seen, I know, Justin, you've written a book on sort of police responses to the Bruce Arthur case. So you have some knowledge of police responses and actions and inactions. Why did the response sort of play out the way that it did? We saw also with homeless encampments, like very aggressive, proactive, sort of violent evictions of people there. This was very different. I think that there's reasons why that may have been. So just curious, and I'll start with you, Amar, why you think it played out the way that it did, why it went on so long, and why that final sort of push out was as tense as it was. Oh, you're muted before you go too far.
Sorry. Yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, Justin can correct me if I'm wrong, but because I wasn't on the ground, as a South Asian father of three, I wasn't going to go wander around too much. However, it seemed to me from the very beginning, based on some of the content on Telegram and elsewhere, that there was a real concern, I guess, on the part of the police that this was strictly going to be a kind of Canada's January 6th moment, right? That they were going to come and largely go after the MPs and largely go after the Parliament buildings. It was a kind of, as Justin has mentioned, like this was happened before. It's been a long time planning. They were saying it quite openly on Telegram what their plans were, yet I don't know how much it trickled into the actual police forces, because I think that there's an approach to it like, let's protect the Parliament buildings, let's protect the MPs, but in the process they kind of forgot about the streets, right? And these trucks were able to come in, basically have cookouts and hot tubs and parties for several weeks before they'd left. Once that happened, then it became kind of intractable, right? Because then you had kids. I think there was some reporting that 25% of trucks had kids sleeping in them. And then you had several weeks of people passing the buck, right? You had the municipal level basically saying that they needed federal involvement, that it was an election year. The Ottawa mayor didn't want to get dirt on him in any way. Then Doug Ford didn't want to deal with it because there was an election in a few months, and so it seemed like people just kept passing the buck around. And Trudeau wasn't going to engage because all of these people are carrying "Hang Trudeau" signs, and so it's not. something you want to legitimate in any meaningful way. And so I think what happened in Ottawa, for me, who was kind of watching the online conversation, seemed inevitable, but it seems like it hadn't really trickled into how the police were thinking about what was about to happen, which was a bit surprising for me. But I do think other cities learned from Ottawa what not to do, right? So Toronto here, you had a very open statement, I think, by the police or somebody who basically said, you can come protest on foot if you like, but your trucks have to stay elsewhere, right? And with the amount of trauma centers and hospitals we have in downtown Toronto, that was a good move. And so that's kind of how it seemed to me, because I have friends who are members of parliament who are getting texts like "stay indoors" and and all these kinds of things. And so it seemed like the cops were focusing on it as if it was the next January 6th moment, and in the meantime they allowed a kind of occupation to slowly build. That's how it looks from the outside to me, anyway. I'm curious to hear what Justin thinks.
Yeah, thanks. I remember there was sort of a frustrating moment where it felt like everybody was just sort of standing there screaming, like, somebody do something. And there was Watson and there's Trudeau and there's Ford all yelling at each other to do something. I did see reports from some of the police that January 6th, that was the plan and it was avoided. Justin, can you give some more context in terms of that police response and whether that was true? And also, your experience there on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that all of those folks coming into the downtown was not an accident, right? Like, this was negotiated. The police in Ottawa deal with an enormous number of protests every year, whether that's on Parliament Hill, whether that's elsewhere in the city. This is not the first truck convoy they've dealt with, and their posture is more or less the same every time, which is, you're free to come, please get a permit. Even if you don't, that's okay. We're going to manage this, but we're not going to prevent you from doing anything as long as it's legal and safe and so on. So there's a bit of an open question as to what the organizers, who they were talking to. First off, it's totally unclear which organizers they were talking to, and what those organizers told the city, right? Because there was a ton of people who were involved in this, Pat King in particular, a whole bunch of others who have said repeatedly, both in public, they've repeated it privately, they said they told the cops this, that they had every intention of coming into the Capitol and staying indefinitely. And if the Ottawa Police Service could have called me up the day before they arrived, and I would have told them, these people are going to stay. They are not going to leave. They have said so repeatedly. You only have to listen to them. I know there's been intelligence assessments that went to the Ottawa Police Service that said the chances of people staying, not the majority, the chance of some people staying, very high. But the Ottawa Police Service maintained the position that they believed the convoy would arrive, spend the weekend on Parliament Hill, and go home by Monday. They're foolishly naive. I get it, because that's what had happened in the past, but just ridiculously naive on their part. And in that context, making space for them to show up, but preparing for the worst case scenario actually makes a ton of sense. Giving people the right and the latitude to protest, reducing the number of conflict points is always really important in this sort of thing. And that's exactly what the idea was, right? So give them space on Parliament Hill. There was actually a really good effort made to block most entrances to Parliament, but give them 2 entries that could go in, so they would all have to kind of like filter through those 2 entrances. Once they got on the hill, they did a very good job of doing not only gates, but kind of double gates, using lines of police and available tactical units to make sure that there was no trouble, keeping police very malleable, friendly, easygoing, relaxed, to keep the tone low. I don't think there was ever a plan for January 6th. I've not seen any indication of that. I have seen a couple of complete yahoos who I don't think actually speak for the majority of those who are there, who said that they would like to see a January 6th. And frankly, I think they were speaking not from a position of authority. So all to say is that I think, frankly, the Ottawa police dealt with that first weekend really well. I think they were wildly mistaken to let those trucks enter the downtown core. I think it's a massive tactical blunder, but in the context of that first weekend, frankly, things went surprisingly well. It was, the weeks that followed where everything really went off the rails. Given that Ottawa police had not really planned for prolonged occupation, they were really outgunned, outmatched. outnumbered. They were outplayed in a bunch of ways. Every time they tried to do enforcement measures, the occupiers beat them. Every time they tried to seize fuel canisters, every single occupier downtown started carrying empty fuel canisters around. Whenever they tried to make arrests, the protesters would swarm police officers and basically make it unsafe for them to conduct the arrest. So Ottawa police it sounds a little bizarre, but were almost irrelevant for those 3 weeks. They didn't have any authority. They couldn't do anything. The best they could do was sort of try and keep the serious criminality at a minimum. They couldn't help people who were being harassed. They could barely investigate, murders that were happening, totally obviously unconnected to the occupation, but there were homicide cops working the beat in downtown Ottawa, trying to keep things cool because Ottawa police just don't have enough personnel to manage this. And they had some support from the OPP, from Toronto Police Service, from Peel, from other services, but it just wasn't enough. So it was an incredibly difficult situation. There was no better way to do this. Lots of people can say, I wish the cops did X, I wish the cops did Y. And to them, I say, how? Like, show me how they were supposed to do that, because it's great to sit back and say the cops should have arrested all these people, but unless you can figure out how they could have done that without getting beaten up by a mob, or having their cop cars flipped over, or having a riot break out, I don't know what the answer to that is. The final operation that cleared out downtown was only made possible because there's a bunch of things that made it possible, but in part because the Federal Emergencies Act allowed them to deputize a huge number of officers very, very quickly. And I've never confirmed this, but I'm told that they actually flew a ton of them in on military transport planes. So the only way this was even made possible is because of a massive influx of officers who were there for 2 days, right? This was never a long-term solution. This had to happen in those 2 days. And it did. And frankly, I'm writing a book about riot policing right now, and I can tell you that this should be a model for how we do things going forward. We should never again in this country accept that heavily armored officers in riot gear should be firing tear gas into crowds of unarmed protesters. We should never again accept that kettling and wanton use of force is the normal for crowd control situations. Ottawa police went into that crowd with the point of view of saying, we're not going to do mass arrests. We are only going to use what force is strictly necessary to clear out the downtown. And we are going to still operate on a basis of deconfliction, not escalation. And frankly, it makes the Toronto Police Service in the context of the G20, makes the Montreal Police Service in the context of the student strike in 2012, and it makes the Vancouver Police and the Quebec City Police and a whole bunch of other police services look insane by comparison. We should never again tolerate the sort of brutal riot policing tactics we've seen in some of these cities, because Ottawa police have shown, even in the context where you have people who could be armed, who are fortified, who have weapons in terms of these trucks, because they are weapons, you can still do so with only 100 arrests, virtually no injuries, and almost zero use of force instances. It's really impressive. I don't often have a lot of compliments for the cops. Genuinely a really good job.
Yeah, I'll just add, I mean, in the context of what Justin said towards the end, this is where there was obviously a lot of critique from racialized communities in Canada who basically were watching how hands-off things were, and we're like, why can't you do this when we do things, right? And the very idea that you would have a bunch of people, call for the dissolution of the government, organize a mass migration to Ottawa, kind of entrench themselves in the city for 3 weeks, or whatever weeks it was, block several US borders. I think they drove around the airport a few times, got caught with weapons. I had a master's student who was downtown in Ottawa, and she came out of one of the media buildings, and she was basically followed by a bunch of people all the way to the train station, right? So they were harassing journalists left and right. The idea that any of that is possible if it was a racialized community, Black, Brown, Muslim protest, is inconceivable to me. That's not to say that we should have treated them the same way. It's that you should treat all future protests in the same way that you've done with what happened in Ottawa. So I completely agree. but it was kind of interesting to watch from a racialized perspective.
Yeah, and even just briefly, like it's so bewildering. It shouldn't be bewildering. I mean, the fact that this was probably one of the most gentle, methodical, slow crowd control situations I've ever seen in my career, and it's still see it referred to as brutal, crackdown from a militarized, however it was phrased by the occupiers and their sympathizers, is just ludicrous. I mean, I think it goes to show the degree to which they see themselves as legitimate freedom fighters, and they see as anyone standing in their way as tyrants and as despots and so on and so forth. These people think. These people genuinely believe that occupation was going to result in Trudeau's removal from office and a restoration of liberty and freedom and good governance to the country of Canada, and that when Ottawa police showed up to clear them out, they were gobsmacked. And every effort, people were crying, people were genuinely shocked and horrified, and I heard people saying, "This is not my Canada," and it's a bunch of people who have never experienced policing before in their life. It's a bunch of people who've never really experienced adversity or what it means for the state to actually crack down on them. It's people who, much like those racialized communities, have never experienced life, in a racialized community that's been over policed. And I think it speaks to the fact that a lot of people experience this pandemic very differently, and a lot of people I don't think had ever really experienced what it's like to have their freedoms even minorly constrained or inconvenienced, and they've responded and have continued responding with just wild bewilderment and in some cases almost violence, or it's actual violence.
Yeah, thanks for that intervention, Amar. I think it's an important point. It seemed to me like, and it's kind of confirmed in what Justin has been saying, like it seemed to me that one of the big differences here was that the police felt like it was almost as though they were afraid to do anything, that they weren't sure what was happening. There were reports that there were ex-cops and ex-military people in the crowd who sort of knew the tactics or could get out ahead of them. And so in a sense, it almost feels like there was this different balance of power. But the question is was it just a question of numbers, or was there something else that's going on, what Amar was getting at? Because it certainly is, as you say, like a very different example of crowd control and of police interactions that ultimately was, I mean, it was surprising how ultimately sort of peaceful everything went down at the end, if you can use that word for having to fly in cops from other parts of the country. The last question, and if people in the audience have questions, you can start to kind of put those in the chat. We're up against about another half hour here. So the last question is about what this means for the future of Canadian politics. I sort of worry that we're going to end on a bit of a negative note here, and I wonder if starting with what order we might go in here. But if you have any thoughts on what this means going forward, Amar, from sort of international comparisons or context, if you have any sense of what we might expect, or based just on what you've said here about the history, what do you think this means for the future of Canadian politics, however you define that, whether you're talking about federal parties or my relationship with my neighbor, whatever definition of politics you use?
This is something I've been thinking about a lot, particularly after the convoy. But I think what we know from, I've studied conspiracy theories probably for 15 years, and one of the things is obvious that once, it's not the particularities of the conspiracy theory that necessarily matter, right? Is that once you become conspiratorial in the way you see the world, you just kind of go from one conspiracy theory to another, and you start to, the COVID pandemic was inevitably going to produce conspiracy theories, because every crisis produces conspiracy theories, from JFK assassination to 9/11 to what have you. This idea of what's known as proportionality bias, right? Like big events have to have big causes. We're not used to having major events have very minor causes or random causes, that this thing could just kind of happen by happenstance. And so once people get into that kind of worldview, you start to see patterns everywhere. There's evil everywhere. There's kind of hidden clues everywhere. And study after study shows once you believe in one theory, you're more likely to believe in 100 others, right? And so I think that's kind of one of the challenges we'll be facing going forward in terms of our electoral politics, in terms of our ability to have conversations, to kind of have a civic discourse, and so on. The other thing that worries me, and this goes back to the pandemic and then obviously the convoy after that, is how quickly we kind of turned on each other. Because I remember, in Public Safety Canada, we used to have events back as early as 2011, I would say, where the question of the entire conference would sometimes be like, are we just one crisis away from our kind of social fabric being torn apart? And the answer then was no. There's Canadian resilience. We'll bounce back, etc. But I think after COVID, I'm not so sure, right? Because the speed at which we politicized everything, the speed at which masks became political, vaccines became political, was quite shocking, or surprising to me anyway. And this idea that we would all kind of rally together around a common enemy or a common fight and actually care about each other didn't turn out to be the case. And so, I think the convoys are kind of the convoy and all these things are kind of exhibits of outward exhibits of this kind of underlying trend of collapse in trust, collapse in our kind of ability to trust avenues of traditional information, our ability to kind of go beyond politics, turn the temperature down a bit and have civic discourse. I worry that a lot of that is kind of diminishing, going or weakening, and how to overturn that, or kind of make sure our social fabric is kind of more resilient to this kind of stuff is something I've been thinking about a lot, because obviously there's going to be another crisis, whether it's another pandemic or climate change or wars or whatever it might be, and the speed at which we're able to turn against each other, I think, is quite alarming. So
one just sort of a follow-up, because there's some people who said that the majority of people did comply with public health measures and masking and with distancing. But that it's kind of it's a minority.
It's a growing minority. Yeah. I mean, I would say that's absolutely right. I mean, 85% of Canadians are double vaxxed, and 50% are triple vaxxed or something like that. And so I'm in no way suggesting that the vast majority of Canadians are conspiracy theorists, but I'm saying that there's a growing minority of people who think this way, but also that these ideas are becoming much more part of our mainstream discourse, to the extent that everyone has to be a kind of extremism expert, right? And to kind of know where these discourses are coming from, to know the platforms that they're coming from, know how to read this information, which wasn't the case even 5 years ago, 6 years ago, right? And so that the trend is going in a more harmful direction, I think, which is what's worrying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Justin?
The reality is, Amar's right, like 83% are fully vaccinated. When you start doing polling on this, you're looking at somewhere between 70 to 80% supporting vaccine passports, vaccine mandates. You're looking at 90% who are still generally supportive of a serious pandemic response. You're talking about 10% of people who are, and it's to somewhere on the spectrum, ardently anti-vaccine. And that tends to be a good signifier of our current kind of conspiracy complement. There are some people who are fully vaccinated who are still conspiracy theorists, but for all intents and purposes, the U.S. has actually very similar numbers. We often love to talk about the U.S. as being significantly worse, but it's actually not. I mean, if you're talking about the core group, the hardcore conspiracy theorists, not Republicans who just don't like vaccine, people who actually believe that the vaccines are inherently dangerous, that they are being pushed, and as our other masks and whatnot are being pushed as a plan to destroy our basic freedoms, that our politicians are bought and sold by an international cabal, stuff like that. When you're talking about that, you're talking about the very, very, very high end, 10% of the population. Which, I don't totally disagree with him when he says that this is a growing movement, because I think it's growing in many respects. But in terms of kind of sheer kind of ceiling of their base of support, I don't know that we're going past 10%. And I think that there's always been 10% of the population who have been receptive to conspiracy theories like this. Now, the question is, how much damage can that 10% do? And in the past, it's been not much, right? Because the things they believe in, the causes they're advancing, the solutions they want have been so unpalatable and have never been entertained, right? So we're talking about, let's go back to the 90s, the militia patriot movement who feared this NWO, New World Order takeover. Well, they didn't have public support. I mean, they actually had there was certainly elements of what they were advocating that became sort of bread and butter of the anti-NAFTA, anti-WTO, various international agency movement, both on the left and right. But by and large, it was not a movement that really went anywhere. The most successful, if we can call it that, outgrowth of this movement was the Oklahoma City bombing, which was a direct sort of consequence of this belief that that America is slowly losing its sovereignty. But frankly, we dealt with that conspiracy movement was managed in such a way that it sort of petered out. Well, the problem with where we're at right now is that we're no longer trying to tamp it down. We're now actively encouraging it. And this is where I start to get genuinely worried. There's always a risk that individual actors from movements like this will commit lone wolf acts or will organize in a group. You actually saw this in Alberta at the Coutts blockade, a small group of folks identified with one of these, one of the sort of militia style groups identified with this movement, developed a plot to kill RCMP officers allegedly. But that is really kind of those isolated instances that are usually sort of low sophistication, relatively easy to prevent. That tends to be the worst case scenario, generally speaking. Obviously, there's much worse cases you can imagine, but generally that is the worst case scenario we're dealing with. But where we're at right now is that media outlets that are of growing popularity, or at least growing kind of prevalence in these circles, political figures, and in increasing volume, elected political representatives are not just playing footsie with these movements, but are outwardly endorsing them. When you hear Pierre Poilievre, the likely next leader of the Conservative Party, speak, not just speak, echo exactly these concerns about the World Economic Forum. When you hear an MP like Colin Kerry get up in the House of Commons, start demanding the government divulge which members of cabinet are members of the World Economic Forum. When you see Andrew Scheer go into the occupied area and start fist pumping with them and all this, it is giving these people validation for their quest. It is making it seem like this 10% is actually 30, 40, 50%. And it's emboldening them, very difficult, in a way that is really worrying. And frankly, I think it might start breaking that 10% ceiling and making this more of a culture war question. No longer will it be, do you believe the World Economic Forum is a malign influence infiltrating our government? It is, do you hate Justin Trudeau? Then join the Conservative Party in our quest against the World Economic Forum. And as stupid as this sounds, this is what Donald Trump did incredibly effectively. He played with conspiracy theories the entire campaign for president, and he weaponized them while he was in the White House. It is why you've seen the complete divorcing from reality of the Republican Party. You have now a political system that does no longer rely on what's happening. It's what you feel is happening. And where that goes is anyone's guess. How that will erode our system of government, I think it's an open question, and it probably won't end anywhere good.
Mara, do you have any final thoughts before I take a couple questions from the crowd here?
Yeah, I mean, there's always this question, which the debate started with Trump and kind of goes on now too, with the same thing with the convoy, is how many people actually believe in something and how many people believe that something isn't necessarily a deal breaker for their participation and their support, right? So you had a lot of people after Trump saying, I'm not a racist. Yes, but Mexico is sending our rapists, Muslim ban, et cetera. You decided that all of these beliefs and statements weren't deal breakers for your support, right? And so that that is a kind of nebulous number of people in Canada who I don't know where to place them, right? And so this was the debate we had back in 2021 with the rise of support for the PPC party, or the People's Party of Canada, which went from what, 1% to 6% or something. And the big question then was, is this just a blip, one-time thing, or is that kind of a signal of what's to come? And I think there's no easy answers to that. We'll just have to kind of wait and see. But there's cause for concern, I would say, that at least there's some sort of changes happening in the water that we should keep an eye on.
I do have a couple questions here from people who are joining us, and any other people who have got questions, feel free to send them to me. This is sort of a quick question. Have the leaders or organizers of the convoy ever actually denounced white supremacy, Confederate flags, or Nazi flags being displayed on Parliament Hill?
Yes, not entirely convincingly, however. I mean, listen, I don't think the organizers identify with the Nazi flag, but it's always a question of, did you create an event where the Nazi flag, where someone who owns a Nazi flag wants to come join, which is never a good thing. But for what it's worth, I can't believe I'm saying that, but it was one Nazi flag. I don't think that one Nazi flag represents the vast majority of people assembled. Now you go to the other things. Pat King, as well as many others, have espoused things that are outwardly white supremacist. You have the Diagolon group, which is tied to the folks who are arrested in Alberta, who have expressed anti-Semitic, far-right, quasi-neo-Nazi, white supremacist views. And they, not only were they part of this movement, they were celebrated, and many of the folks who identify with the convoy now openly either identify as being part of the Diagolon movement, or at least supporting it. Canada First, a group modeled after the far-right neo-Nazi America First group in the US, outwardly kind of a stylized version of the neo-Nazi movement. Absolutely a white supremacist group. Pat King, like I said, has expressed the white genocide theory. So white supremacists were prevalent there. I don't think they were the majority. I don't think it was the reason for the vast majority of people who came out. But there's this really frustrating thing that happened where the organizers kept coming out and saying, we're not racist. Whoever brought these Confederate flags was not part of our movement, and we reject them. Well, one of the people who was saying that is a guy named Chris Barber, and somebody recommended I go check out Chris Barber's TikTok feed. And on Chris Barber's TikTok feed, hanging out in his garage, hanging above the doors of his garage, are two Confederate flags. When that was pointed out to him, he went on a live stream a couple of days later going, yeah, okay, fine, but they're just pieces of cloth. Well, do you reject the Confederate flag, or are they just pieces of cloth? Because it can't really be both. So I think a ton of people in the media, and obviously a lot of the supporters, heard them say these things like, we reject the Confederate flag, and never thought to ask themselves, are they lying? Because frankly, these people lied a lot. They understand how to make their movement publicly palatable and how important talking points are in this context, and they relied on them heavily, and frankly, they lied to our faces a ton, and we believe them. I can't fathom why.
Yeah, I mean, that's an important point, is that there's a lot of, this is a huge shift, again, detailed also in Justin's podcast, is the kind of professionalization of this movement over time, right? I think people think it started with Richard Spencer in 2015, where all of a sudden there were neo-Nazis in suits standing in hotel ballrooms. But no, this was a planned strategy from at least a decade or two before then, to kind of say, skinheads and neo-Nazis aren't necessarily palatable anymore. We have to dress differently, talk differently. We have to recruit differently, and you're seeing some of that trend also continue with these guys. But I agree. I don't think it was. I saw on Twitter people calling it a Nazi rally and a far right rally, and I don't think that's fair. I think there were definitely some who probably sympathize with that. The organizers definitely sympathize with that. But I think we're underplaying the kind of overall grievance and exhaustion with COVID that a lot of people felt, right? There were people who lost businesses, friends who'd committed suicide. We were coming out of our fourth lockdown. I mean, this is, there's reason to be angry. And I think for a lot of them, the protest moment itself was quite emotionally, psychologically satisfying. Just being with one another, yelling into the void, meant something, was something that they got a lot out of, which is fine, right? And so so I think labeling it as a Nazi rally is inaccurate. And also there's this kind of weird nuance of, are you calling Trudeau a Nazi, or are you declaring yourself to be a Nazi by carrying some of these flags, right? Because there was a Canadian flag with like a Nazi drawn on, a swastika drawn on it. And it was clear that he was saying the Canadian government is a Nazi regime, not necessarily declaring himself to be a Nazi supporter. You know, we don't want to, this kind of swastika nuance is probably exhausting, but at the same time, it is what happened, right? And so I don't think it's fair to kind of dismiss the entirety of the protest as far right, but
yeah, and I think it's very, very clear to me that the organizers are far right. Like, you can point to many of them, and again, QAnon believer, guy who espoused the white genocide theory, a guy who's being sued for like $50K because he called every major Muslim in Canada a front for the Muslim Brotherhood, and who has tied the people who organize this identify with the far right, are of the far right, and I think that's very clear. The people who came out, I think by and large, there were definitely groups there, and there were definitely individuals there who are identified with the far right, who have made up the backbone of far right movements for quite some time. But there's also a ton of people, I spoke to some of them, who've never been in a protest in their life, have no, I think, political affiliation beyond being like vaguely conservative, who I don't think would ever identify with these movements. Might believe some racist things, might have, but welcome to tons of people in this country, right? Like, that's not terribly surprising. Would have no affiliation with any groups that are white nationalist. And I think Amar is exactly right. Like, the prevailing fundamental thing that drove these people was anti-COVID, anti-vaccine. Not everyone there was anti-vaccine, but everyone there kind of lived in a universe where vaccines are dangerous or untrustworthy or shouldn't be recommended. And and the other thing I think motivated people was this World Economic Forum thing. I realize people kind of bristle at it, thinking it's just such a fringe, weird thing. Why would 18,000 people believe in it? But I cannot tell you how ubiquitous it was. You hear it on the street, you see it on signs, you see it written on people's trucks, you hear people talking about it, they talk about it on the live streams, they talk about it in the press conferences. It is a thing that regular people don't hear about, that is just standard for these folks, and it was standard at this occupation.
It goes back to this proportionality bias thing, right? Is that it can't, the fact that we've been under lockdown for 3 years can't just be a random occurrence with something that happened in a lab in Wuhan, China. No, there was a sinister cabal of people who had economic motives for bringing all of this about, which is a much more satisfying explanation. You have someone to point to. It's not just a kind of nebulous cloud over there that's responsible for everything that's happened to me and my small business over the last 3 years. No, I have people to blame. I have people I have something I could do about it, right?
Yep.
I don't know if any of you listen to the Brene Brown's podcast, but she had this, she's a social worker, PhD, who's done a lot of work on vulnerability and emotions. And she had this sort of, this line where she said that because she likes to understand things, and she likes to, because it makes her feel sort of safer, just to say how kind of this way of thinking is actually quite understandable. And like she said, I would have rather personally caused this than for it to have just happened, because at least then it could be understandable and there could be somebody who could be held accountable. But the notion that this just kind of happened and something like this will happen again is really, it really is discomforting. It really is kind of makes you feel kind of insecure about things. I have a question here about or more of a comment kind of about attitudes around policing. This person says, I'm a law-abiding senior citizen, and it was distressing to see the police not doing anything about the laws that were being broken. Next time I'm arrested for a traffic violation or stopped for a traffic violation, I'll certainly wonder why the police is doing this and won't be as polite as I've been. I wonder if you think this is reflective of broader attitudes maybe towards police who don't have sort of the understanding exactly of what happened and just see very different reactions from the police when faced with this convoy versus when faced with kind of other things. Maybe Amar, do you just based on some of your comments about different ways that police react with different communities? Do you see this sort of affecting attitudes and relations?
Oh, I mean, in heavily police communities, this attitude is there already. There's a kind of policing fatigue for sure in a lot of these communities. And I mean, I don't have to drive too far out of the province to be pulled over quite quickly, right? And I may, you know, whatever I am. And so I think that fatigue is there for sure. But I mean, this is going back to January 6th as well, is like the way they walked into these buildings and put their feet up on Pelosi's desk is, as Justin was saying earlier, is like they'd never had the gaze of law enforcement pointed at them before, and therefore it was a entirely unique feeling and a kind of shocking feeling, right? Is like how could this happen to us, right? And I think that doesn't exist necessarily in most other racialized communities in Canada or the US. So yeah, we might see some engagement, negative engagement with the police going forward, but I don't know how you measure that.
Sure.
We'll probably wrap this up in just a couple more minutes. There is one more question here about conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories are a century old. So what is new about these movements? Why are they becoming more mainstream? This sort of touches on some of the things we talked about this particular moment in, you know, global history. Why? Oh, I got another one here. Sorry. Why are they becoming more mainstream in discourses, and why are conspirationist minorities growing now? Is it a supply issue? Is the appetite for these issues changing as well? And then finally, the question maybe to focus more on what are the suggestions to slow down worrying trends?
Yeah.
Either of you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't actually know that these conspiracy theories are becoming more common or prevalent or more major in the discourse. Again, you go back to some of these conspiracy theories through the 20th century, and they were incredibly, especially in a kind of a media market where it was less regulated, less scrutiny, and everyone read the daily newspaper. You know, these conspiracy theories could go very, very far and become very, very prevalent. We tend to actually, believe it or not, have a better media literacy these days. We tend to be a little more skeptical of things like that. If anything, part of the reason why some of these conspiracy theories have become prevalent is because we become too skeptical of the media and too skeptical of governments, too distrustful. But all that said, you know, I think the internet has clearly, you know, made these things prevalent in a kind of unbelievable way. You can live, especially if you lived in downtown Ottawa those 3 weeks, if you lived in the Convoy and the occupation, you lived in a captive media market. You could spend every day, all day, only reading, watching, listening to you know, news from produced by people in the occupation who support the occupation for people in the occupation. It meant that you live in a universe where you don't get any, you know, let's use an alternative facts. You could live in a little bubble where everything just reinforces your worldview that you are a fighter for freedom and justice, and everyone else is out to get you, which is a very dangerous thing. We've never been able to live in a world that isolated and cut off before. And you know, the solution for that, I think Amar might know better than I would, because I think I'm frequently at a loss for what solutions look like here. But solutions mean getting people out of those bubbles. You know, when the Islamic State was proving itself incredibly effective at, you know, getting folks here trapped in those little information bubbles, part of our solution was literally to use between, you know, cyber and bombs to blow up the place where they were doing part of this radicalization, right? It also, you know, we've spent decades trying to figure out what it looks like to deprogram people. When people joined cults in the 60s and 70s, we used to kidnap them and put them in a hotel room, strap them down, and try to convince them to leave, and that did not work out very well. You know, more recently, we've been you know, trying really hard to just show people that there is, you know, more to life than their ridiculous conspiracy theory, and maybe it's been a little more effective. You know, there are people out there who spend their time online just trying to argue and break down the walls of some of these conspiracy theorists, and it seems to be having a little bit of positive effect. The solution is not simple, and we haven't figured it out yet. But it's definitely going to involve getting people out of these little cocoons they built for themselves.
No, I mean, I think that's fundamentally right. It's just a massive challenging massively challenging. I mean, I do a lot of work with social media companies to help them navigate this sphere, and it's an ongoing discussion in Facebook, or Meta as they now call themselves, Twitter, TikTok, and all these platforms. Is where do you draw that line, right? It's very easy to take down ISIS beheading videos and Al Qaeda videos, but what do you do with build the wall rhetoric? What do you do with some of these things that are very closely scaling the line between accepted free speech, which should remain free speech, and things that are genuinely misinformation, disinformation, and harmful? I don't think they've really figured out a way to do that yet. But in terms of these alternative communities, that's the new norm now, right? Is Telegram and a lot of these platforms like BitChute and Rumble used to be kind of fringe platforms that had a bunch of different people, very small numbers of people, but now Telegram Convoy channels have 50, 60, 70,000 people in them. And so they're commanding a lot of people in these closed environments who don't necessarily receive any other outside information, right? And in terms of demographics, there's also an important point, is that I think tend to assume that digital natives are somehow also digitally literate. They're not, right? Just because you kind of grew up with the internet doesn't mean you know how to consume that information, or that you understand how that information is being presented to you. So that's for young people, but I get a lot of DMs on Twitter from young people who are like, my mom has gone down the QAnon rabbit hole, for example, right? And, do you know anyone who can help? And I have to often reply, like, not really, because our entire prevention apparatus is tailor-made for young, angry men, right? But what the trend now is, a lot of older people are falling into these movements. If you're a 65-year-old grandmother with a Q t-shirt, there's not much programming there for you in terms of prevention or finding your way out of there, right? And so I think we're at a moment where a lot of this requires a rethink or adaptation at the very least, to see how we can do it. But the old cliched things are still true, I think, teaching proper digital literacy, giving people a sense of community outside just online chat rooms, are all were important and remain important. But in terms of actual prevention, a lot of new things need to be done that are kind of slowly happening, but not probably fast enough. Definitely not fast enough to keep up with what's actually happening.
Yeah, thanks. That's an interesting point to kind of land on, and the thought about who it is who's now getting sucked into different conspiracy theories, and who it is who's behind some of these sort of, whether it's that 10% or speaking up more. I cut my own hair this weekend because I live in a small town, and the hairstylist, I have it on very good reputation, a very good note, that is a QAnon person or support or whatever. So
I think my mom is a conspiracy theorist too. I don't know what is with barbers, but it's a real problem.
Yeah, I mean, I've gotten pretty good at it with my hair cutting chops are getting better over 2 years of several haircuts. But on that note, that was a really great conversation. I thank you both so much for being here. We have a lot of students at undergrad and graduate level. I think political science students are very interested in journalism as a career. And I think, Justin, you've given us a really great example of the role that journalists play and the expertise that journalists have, and the ability to track and to put things together. Amar, as well, with your work internationally, your work here, an academic who's working, with various companies and having conversations like these are. You're both really great examples of what do you do with a political science? Justin, did you do political science?
No, I dropped out of school.
Oh, well, okay. But when you graduate, go into journalism or whatever. I mean, that's a good way to do it anyways. But so thank you both for being here, for having this conversation with us. I think it's an important one. There's a lot of things that I've learned, a lot of things to continue to think about. You're both on social media. We were tweeting about it. If you want more, you can follow them both, read their work, read their books and everything. And thank you so much again. This was the first time we've kind of done a public affairs panel, and I for one really enjoyed it. I appreciated the back and forth. And so thank you both so much for
Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks.